Joel, it's all you. Come on up here as you're kind of navigating your way up. I just want to introduce Joel Braunold. I feel really, really lucky. This community is full of really smart people who know a lot of things about a lot of things. Most of you know a lot of things about things that aren't necessarily your professional job, but you have a lot of opinions about, like all of us. And I think in this moment right now, we are starved for high-level, deeply informed, broad understanding of what is happening in our world generally. The particular expertise that Joel brings is the Middle East. His job before the job that he is doing now was running the Alliance for Middle East Peace, which is the trade organization of all of the different people-to-people organizations, Israelis and Palestinians, trying to do grasswork, ground-up peace building. And I don't know, I think of Joel as the James Bond of Middle East peacemaking because he's like everywhere. He's behind the scenes. He's, dropping me a note to say, here is the address of the mosque that you should go and go to the funeral of Wadia Al-Fayoumeh, because I've spoken with the executive director of CARE, the Muslim, the committee for
Council on Arab-Islamic Relations.
Thank you, in Chicago, and you should go, and they want Jews and rabbis to be there. And I say, really? How are you doing that at the same time as making peace in the Middle East? And so I asked if he would shed a little bit of light on, I think, something that is not as reported on, which is all of the various forces that are feeding this conflict. Because I think we all know this conflict is not simply about history or about justice or about rights. There's a lot more, and I certainly don't know all of it, and I don't think we're going to get to all of it in the half hour-ish that we have with Joel. I asked him to speak for about 15 minutes and then to be able to take questions. And so we'll see how it goes. All right? Thank you, everybody, for being here. And thank you for being here.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi Lizzie. And thank you, Rabbi Lizzie, alongside the other rabbis who did go to the funeral. It was very important for our community to be there, and it was very welcomed by the Palestinian American community in Chicago, and it was incredibly important. It's difficult to know where to start. 2 weeks ago, on October 7th, which was 2 weeks ago, and it feels like a lifetime ago, we woke up to this terrible news. As Rabbi Lizzie said, I used to run the Alliance for Middle East Peace, and I woke up to the news of dear friends and colleagues who were kidnapped, 75-year-old Vivian Silva, who is a giant in our movement, nephews of Mohammed Dawasha from Givat Chaviva who were murdered, just unimaginable amounts of trauma. As the week progressed, and my current job is doing a lot more top-down policy support, we were called upon to give policy support to governments around the world, our government, to help international NGOs try and get water, food, and humanitarian supplies into Gaza, to help Gaza's Christian community, to support my staff members who have mothers and brothers in Gaza. On a personal level, 7 of my first cousins and my brother have all been called up. My brother called me to raise $60,000 for medical equipment for helicopter rescue, which they were lacking. It's been a lot, and I think to start with, it's important to recognize that. In one day, Israel suffered more deaths from terrorism than the entire Second Intifada. In 1 week, the people in Gaza have experienced more war than they have in the previous 15. For Jews around the world, it feels like all of our triggering emotions of being alone and being abandoned have happened at once. And for Muslim and Palestinian Americans and Arabs across the West, it feels very much like a post-9/11 moment. And I think that's an important context. What October 7th represents moving forward has really been, there was a phrase in Israel after the 1973 war, the Yom Kippur War, of the collapse of the concept. And the concept that Hamas represented a tolerable terrorist threat collapsed, and that Hamas is now an intolerable military threat. It is intolerable. It is not tolerable and it is existential. But yet, I would argue that as great as the intelligence and security failure was that led up to the events of October 7th, the policy failure is as great. For 15 years, people have been screaming, you can't invest in Hamas at the expense of the Palestinian Authority. This is a mistake to try and defeat the Palestinian national movement by literally giving suitcases of Qatari cash into Gaza, promised to create ceasefires, enabling Hamas to control its own crossings in the Saladin Gate. You're empowering an entity at the expense of a diplomatic horizon. And that collapse is also something that is motivating things moving forward, because Israel is left with no good policy options. An Israeli friend called me and said, why has the situation changed? Why this week does it feel like the world is swinging the other way? And I said, it's like you have a hole in the bottom of your boat. That if there is no policy capture to what your military objectives are, if you cannot express what comes next, what is it that you are trying to achieve, it enables everyone to fill what you are trying to achieve with their worst fears. Are you trying to create another Nakba? Is it about ethnically cleansing Palestinians off the land? Can you promise, if you ask people to leave their homes, that they'll be allowed to come back in? Because at the moment, no one believes you, and no one can hear you, and that is not just Gazan residents. It is the entire Mideast, from your allies and friends to your enemies. And into that space, people's worst fears are being imagined. And so Rabbi Lizzie asked me, instead of doing a bottom-up, to do a top-down, sort of what's going on wider region. And I'll start with what Prince Turki of Saudi Arabia said 3 days ago. Prince Turki was the former US ambassador for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. He doesn't hold an official position in the kingdom. I had an opportunity to meet with Prince Turki in Riyadh 4 weeks ago. It's a very interesting and experienced diplomat. And in his speech that he gave, he condemned Hamas for its terrorist atrocities. He condemned them for bringing this coming on, and he condemned this current government of Israel for their policies that have led to this point. And his condemnation was long and fulfilled, and he condemned Qatar for funding Hamas. And the condemnations you can hear coming across the region is that none of the Sunni regional allies that Israel has been trying to build relations with through the Abraham Accords and others want to be led by Hamas. They don't want Hamas to seize the order paper, to try and change and move the region into that position. They don't want the Iranians and the Iranian allies, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah in the north, or their militias that happen to be the Houthis in Yemen, who fired cruise missiles yesterday that were shot down by the Americans, or their allies in Iraq who are now attacking American bases. They don't want the Iranians to have this ability to dictate the order paper. But the Palestinian cause still lights up the Arab streets. It is still something that people will be motivated by. And it is something that is not ignorable. And in the shuttle diplomacy that Secretary of State Blinken did over the past week, where he visited 8 countries in 3 days and then went back to Israel before President Biden came back, he heard a universal message that no country would take Palestinians. And people said to me, how could they be so cruel? How could no one host them? It wasn't an act of cruelty from the Arab states, from their thing. They don't want to enable another refugee problem from the Palestinians. They want them to be able to stay on their land. And they said, even if you're dealing with this intolerable threat militarily, if you can't promise us what comes next, does this lead to a political process where we try and work out Palestinian national aspirations? If we can't have that conversation, then we don't trust you. And that has created a complex situation for Israel as it tries to navigate its justifiable horror and rage at the brutality of what happened. And that's very difficult for people not inside the Jewish community to hear, because of just the general suffering, because October 7th, from the eyes of many people, has ended, and now it's about the Israeli response and what's going on a daily basis and what's happening. But the brutality as the stories come out of what happened that day are unimaginable. And they're dripping out as more and more information comes. And the level of brutality is important because for Israel and for Israelis, and this is across the board, Hamas turned into ISIS. And if it's ISIS, then there's no negotiation, there's no talking about it. And for the region, even if they are disgusted, and they are, and you can hear there was an Arab reporter who interviewed Ismail Haniyeh on television and said, what did you expect to happen? Look at what happened. And there's obfuscation, and there's we didn't do this, it was other people, it was this, it was that. The reality is, there is disgust, but there is a question. What comes next? And if it is that the only thing that can be done is a total war against Gaza and against 2.3 million people, the region will not tolerate it. And so Israel is stuck in this position. And as our own administration, we've lent on President Biden's superpower of empathy, which was so needed. He has spent more time with the victims and the hostage families than anyone in the government of Israel. And you hear that from across Israeli spectrums. He has spent time, despite his staff trying to rush him off, flying into a war zone, speaking to every last one of them, listening to their stories, hearing them, and hugging them, while also giving the really important message that if this is the equivalent of 15 9/11s that happened on one day, learn from our mistakes as well. And that while you persecute the military campaign to remove this intolerable military threat, recognize that you cannot make the same mistakes that we did. To defeat ISIS, it took 85 countries 5 years. And ISIS, we knew that when ISIS was defeated, that territory would be returned to those countries where ISIS had been. How long does Israel have? Who will take over the territory once Hamas is gone? These are questions that need to be asked and answered. And these are also questions not for you to have to answer as you think about this. It is not your responsibility, but it is the responsibility of the leadership in Israel. And it is the responsibility of our leadership and others, that if people are willing to try and enable this, they have to have answers. Because it is not fair, and it is not an expectation to start a situation that we don't know how it ends. Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israel's Arab conflict, has always been a space where geostrategic battles have been fought. Between the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, there was the war of attrition, where Russia would give Egypt sort of military assets that would go and do soirees, and the whole thing as the Israelis responded is, how can we respond without dragging the Soviet Union in, okay? And we've seen this constantly, and it was actually interesting, the Madrid process in 1991 was chaired by Russia and the US. And the Oslo Accords were jointly held because the point was that we could bring the superpowers together to try and actually solve one of these conflicts and actually get out of ourselves. Of course, we all know the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has not been solved. And so now we see different powers, regional powers and others, once again, utilizing this for their own purposes. As I described, we've got the Iranian part of this, that the Abraham Accords was trying to hold back, but given the lack of policy or political horizon for the Palestinians, has been shaken to its core, and we'll have to see if it can survive. We'll see if the Turks continue to move to a more even-handed thing between the Israelis, or if it will collapse backwards to where it was before. And now we're seeing that as the US has tried to persecute a campaign against Russian aggression in Ukraine, that the field of vision has now switched to Gaza. And Russia and China and other geostrategic competitors of the US look at this and say, see, look, the US has its own issues. It's got its own things. The US doesn't stand for international humanitarian rights or law or the law of conquest or anything else. And so this once again motivates something else. And that a conflict that is so close to so many of us and who have family members there, have emotive connections, it is now just another paint-by-numbers board for geostrategic interests of what happens. And this is the complexity of what's gone on and what happens next. And this is the time-limiting factor, and this is why we need a policy. No one can tell you in the next 5 days, 10 days, 3 weeks what that policy could look like, who might take over Gaza, who will, who won't. But the one thing is clear. For wall-to-wall in Israel, it can't go back to how it was before. And how this moment can help propel to a different perspective and what can happen next is essential. And whether, as this war is persecuted, humanitarian pauses can happen so that we don't have a cholera outbreak in Gaza, and that requires water and power. How can you do that without that being diverted to Hamas? These are all difficult, complicated conversations, but ones that must be asked. And we have to hold in our heart collectively the shared trauma and humanity of what's going on right now. Because ultimately, as much as people are fighting about how a baby was killed or who hit a hospital, for the people in the region, it's reached beyond that level. The brutality of what happened on October 7th is enmeshed into the heart and the story of Israel, and it's never going to be unpicked. No amount of advocacy or forensic analysis is going to change that. And much like the hospital, it does matter from an accountability and justice and ICC perspective, but from a practical of escalation perspective, it doesn't matter. It is a symbol of lives lost, of people dying, and if it, every day as the collateral damage, if you want to call it that way, or as the targeted strikes hit in heavily populated areas, and the statements that are driven from rage and pain of Israeli officials that are dehumanizing are occupying the ears of people who see what's going on, and they just see dead civilians. And this is the complex problem that we now see, and it will not be a short problem, and it will go on. It will be long. But I will say, in terms of some elements of positivity, the first is we haven't seen a collapse like we did in May 2021 of intercommunal violence in Israel. The Arab citizens of Israel have shown a level of restraint and responsibility of not wanting to be dragged by Hamas. We've seen statements from Ayman Odeh, the leader of Hadash, Mansour Abbas, the leader of an Islamist movement in Israel, make statements saying this is a place that we will not be dragged into. And we have to be able to try and utilize this moment. We haven't seen East Jerusalem explode. We've had 2 Fridays and it's managed to remain relatively calm. And that is off the work of hundreds of dedicated professionals, conflict resolution people, security services, religious authorities, desperately trying to keep the powder keg from exploding. But we're also seeing extremists use this opportunity to do things in the West Bank. We're also seeing Hamas cells in the West Bank trying to motivate and other things, and these are things that need to be pushed against. But we haven't seen that. And I will say that Rabbi Lizzie, Rabbi Ari Hart, Rabbi Josh Fagelson, the other rabbis who attended the funeral of the Wahami family is also an important thing. Because here in Chicago, we have the largest Palestinian community outside of Santiago in Chile and the Middle East. We are the largest Palestinian city in the West. And it's something that I would say that many in our community don't know and have had no connections with and are surprised. I think it's important for all of us to find those opportunities that we collectively try and make sure that our communities are safe and secure here, because that is the least that we can do. And I'll pause there and happy to answer whatever questions some of you might have.
If you plan to ask a question, think about how to just distill it down into a question. And so that the folks, I know we have a bunch of folks at home who are connecting, and so I want you to be able to be heard. So come close to lean in and ask her to introduce yourself too, please.
Hi, my name is Sherry Young. I'm not a member here, first time here, and we are definitely enjoying it and appreciating it. My quick question to you is, I feel like, I'll speak for myself, I need to be more educated, and I would like suggestions for books to read. Someone suggested, can we talk about Israel? And we're reading that. I also know there's letters to my Palestinian neighbors, but I just wondered if you had a few suggestions that are balanced pieces of information.
Thank you, Sherry.
They're it's pick out of a library. I'll just give one book rather than a lot. I'm of a person of narratives and stories. That's how I could give you geostrategic books. I don't think they're the most interesting. I'm a huge fan of City of Oranges by Adam Lebois that tells the story of Yafo from the perspective of 5 Jewish families and 5 Arab Palestinian families. I think it actually captures a lot of the humanity of pre-state Israel, and I think it's a very interesting book that's meant a lot to me. sort of like everything in this conflict, it's sort of the books you suggest sort of tell on who you are, which is why I like Adam and a few others. You know, I could tell you, you know, Righteous Victims by Benny Morris is a very interesting new historian book. Tom Segev's The Seventh Million, I think, is very interesting. A lot of people like Ephraim Kirsch, Shlomo Ben Ami, Scars of War, Scars of Peace. There's more contemporary books. But, you know, I would say if there's a collection that really represents a Palestinian narrative and a collection that really represents an Israeli narrative, read both. And have a rich diet of news as best as you can. Adam Lebois is the author, and the book is called City of Oranges.
And if you need that repeated, you can go back and listen to the podcast, which will be up in a day or two. All right, great. Here, a quickie, sure. Introduce yourself.
I'm Ricky Lippitz. Can you tell us what's happening locally? I think it was surely a privilege to be at the funeral. What might be happening upcoming? Who might be organizing it? I know it would come through a Mishkan email, but can you give us some sense for people motivated to link hands and proclaim humanity? Where can we look for that?
I'm actually gonna throw that one to you because I helped out there as a Jewish Chicagoan, but professionally, I'm all around the world at this point. So, yeah. So,
I mean, first of all, I think there's not enough, and I mean, one of my questions to Joel was going to be, you know, there is a deep lack of trust, I think, like a gulf of a lack of trust, you know, that goes both ways. But I think in this particular case, getting through that in the current climate while also saying things like, you know, if you're a Jew and saying like, I support Israel, I think would be an affront to the Palestinian who is like, but do you know what they're doing to us right now? And so I think that the deep lack of trust, and then, you know, and then saying, but do you, the conversation obviously goes both ways, but do you support what Hamas did to my people? And that, like, that's actually, we would need to move the lens to be about something where, I mean, like, there was just no argument that, like, what happened to this kid was horrendous and any person of conscience needed to be there. The question is, like, where can we gather in places of trust and safety for, you know, for the people who show up, which I think feels both risky and very important. And there's a lot of room for that. What were you going to say?
I'll just say, I think it's important to be authentically ourselves. You know, the reason I reached out to Rabbi Lizzie and Rabbi Ari and others is I thought it was important that, you know, Rabbi Ari is a modern Orthodox rabbi from Skokie Valley and is a proud religious Zionist. I think it's very important that the heart of the Jewish community turned up. And I think you should turn up with who you are. Right now, when people's blood's boiling, my own interpretation, I would look to our state leaders to invite Palestinian American, Chicagoland representatives and Jewish community leadership to just talk about safety and security of our community and just start there. Just the host should be neutral. Let's just start there. And then through those interactions, if we're in the same room, people can just even start knowing who one another are. I think that's the place to start. We don't need to take it at a time of peak trauma now to start building that. And, you know, I can go into the whole critiques of how people to people can work and can't work. But I think right now we are all suffering from a lack of feeling safe, secure, and heard and listened to. And I think it's very important that our elected officials, whether they are Jewish elected officials, Palestinian elected officials, neutral elected officials, do their jobs as elected officials of our state and bring us as two communities to a place that we can both hear from them about what they're doing to make us safe and secure here in the state of Illinois. And I think that that's the place that I'd like to see it start.
Here, if any, let's see. I can't, like, go very far with this, so let's see. Avi and then Aiden. Why don't you ask your questions in order, and then Joel can sort of...
We can repeat them maybe on the mic.
Oh, fine. All right, Avi, go ahead. Sure. Yeah.
Just thank you for all that, by the way. Recognizing the extreme problems of city policy failure, from a practical standpoint, what choices does Israel have right now, given the ground with hostages?
So I'll just repeat. Can I repeat? Oh. Given the historic policy failures that have brought us to this moment, and you said earlier Israel doesn't have any good options, what are Israel's options given hostages, given just where we are? What are Israel's options? And then do you want to say your question, Aiden?
Yes.
Yeah.
My name is Aiden Gilbert, and I wondered how the status of the remaining hostages, which is the overwhelming majority of them, changes the calculus for diplomacy, security responses, and the people-to-people work you've been talking about.
Great. And Aiden kind of adds to that. How does the existence of the remaining hostages, which is the overwhelming amount of them, change the calculus? Great.
The issue of hostages, both in Jewish law and in Israeli policy tradition, is incredibly complicated. There is no higher, throughout our Talmudic tradition and our religious tradition, we just sang Achenu here, like the role of rescuing hostages is probably up there with the highest things we can do. And Israel traditionally paid an incredibly high price for hostages, and Hamas knows that. And it's not been interesting. It's been clear that from an Israeli government planning position, the prioritization of return of hostages is not the prime mission of this war. And it's difficult to say that, but it's been very clear. It's, of course, Israel is calling for the unconditional release of its hostages. But that's not the prime objective. And the voice of the hostage families, there's protests happening in Israel as they try and get their voice heard more. And it's complicated, and it also creates a division between Israel and its allied Western countries who are looking to get their citizens out. And, there's been news reports that Western allies are pushing on Israel to prevent the ground invasion or delay it so there can be more time for hostage negotiations. And Hamas is also, as we heard the good news on Erev Shabbos that the 2 American hostages were released. And Hamas said it was for humanitarian purposes. I mean, it's not humanitarian to release the hostages that you took and the babies and the children and the other people that you took. Right? We're not just talking about soldiers in uniforms. So, spare me that. And there's clearly a way that Hamas is trying to utilize a drip approach to try and buy more time and try and do it. Hamas would release all the hostages tomorrow if Israel would just stop, because it feels like it's won. And as I said, Israel cannot have this intolerable threat on its southern border. And so that's the complication. And for your policy question about what do you do, and where's the priority of order of what you do with these hostages? And it's a nightmare. It's genuinely a nightmare. And, I think in addition to the policy options, it's who gets to decide. So we've seen that Benny Gantz joined the war cabinet with Gadi Eisenkot, so 2 former chiefs of staff, in the war cabinet, but it's still extremely unclear who is actually making decisions. Is it the war cabinet or is it the wider security cabinet? And it's important because, who gets to decide how this war ends? Is it those 4, where it's two of the opposition and 2 of the Likud? Is it the wider group that includes Smotrich and Ben Gvir and others? And that's really important to try and understand. It's not clear if Aryeh Deri's in the cabinet or not. Like, it's this bizarre thing that he's in the pictures, but technically he's not a government minister, but he's the chair of Shas. And all of this is important because what policy options require, like, who's making the policy decision. And Yair Lapid, the leader of the opposition, was clear that he didn't join the government because he doesn't think that they're able to, at the end, enable to hand this off to the PA or some other thing for Palestinian self-rule. And he doesn't want to be part of that. And that he doesn't think that they're really empowered to make those decisions. And so there aren't very good policy options, but also there's a restriction of the policy horizon given the politics of the people who have been ruling the country for the past 8 months. And that, again, really restrains so many of the regional allies who were trying to work through their own relationships with this new government in Israel, very tough, very difficult, and how they could do that. And so it's just exacerbating the problems. So what are the options? Gallant, the defense minister, said some level of ground invasion, then followed by a base of operations that you could do counterterrorism from, and then some sort of new security regime ruling over Gaza. And as many have pointed out, that was the US plan for Iraq, and it didn't particularly work. So, like, what does that look like and how? And there's no easy answer, right? It's not like a got ya, well, that was right. It's really tough to figure out. And the analogy, I spoke to an AJC crowd. I can see friends who were there before. And the analogy I gave is that you basically have a patient who now is riddled with cancer, has diabetes, and has gout, and is like lying on the hospital bed. And they're like, well, how do I get better? It's like, well, we need to have talked about this like a little bit beforehand, and like trying to deal with it now. And so that's really complicated. To the second question, I think I answered a lot of it, but in terms of P2P, I mean, I encourage you all to read. There was a wonderful piece that was put out on Friday by Noam Schuster on 972. Noam is a friend. She has been part of the people-to-people community for many years. She's a stand-up comic. Her latest skit was, Coexistence My Ass. And read that. None of us have had time to grieve. I had a very progressive funder call me and say, where's the ceasefire movement in Israel? And I said, I'm going to say something really horrible. They said, why? I said, they've literally been massacred. I said, the base of Meretz, the base of labor, were the people in the Gaza envelope. That's where they live. That's where they are. It's just unimaginable. So, the people-to-people community, some are calling for ceasefires, some are, there's been a push by some of the hostage families or people who have lost people to call for an end of the secessions, so there's a multitude of voices coming from that community, but it's really difficult both in Palestinian society and in Israeli society to offer competing voices. We've seen activists arrested in Israel. There's tremendous pressure in Palestinian society. And even when you dig below the surface and there's a huge debate about Hamas, there's a feeling like this isn't the time to have that conversation. Just like any other people, there's a rally to the flag moment, like when there's war and there's bombing going on. And it's a very tough moment, but I'll just say, no one's had time to grieve. And I think that's very, very important that, they can hear supporters screaming online, and the people who have been like the number one people standing up against occupation, who have gone to every single, protest and everything else, they're grieving. They're sitting there and grieving. And, there's a real feeling in progressive Israel as well. And this isn't towards Palestinians, who they're not expecting this from, by the way, but from parts of the progressive left, of just true abandonment and true inability to recognize the pain and trauma they went through, that this is all what decolonization means. And even those who are scholars of decolonization, Adam Schatz wrote a beautiful piece in the London Review of Books yesterday. You have to have the moral fortitude to be able to condemn it. You just have to. And if you don't have that, then you're not... it was all just a facade. It's just ethno-tribalism, right? And it's just a different version of it, right? For a lot of people who have come to fruition over the past 15 years, they came to fruition after the Second Intifada. And, they've often, rockets of fireworks and this and that. And the brutality of what Hamas did, they haven't, experienced... They haven't had to justify that before or explain it or condemn it. And at their first opportunity, they sort of fell flat. And in many ways, they're a reflection of the same people within parts of the Jewish community who explain away settler violence or like extreme levels of that and sort of how that looks. And it's just ethno-tribalism. And it wasn't really based off a worldview of universal human rights, because it clearly can't be. And so that's a challenge that also people are starting to unpick through. And what does that look like?
Wow. Oh, man. Well, this was the half hour. I feel like we could stay here for a lot longer to continue talking, and I would love that. And I don't know what your afternoon looks like after we make Kiddush. Are you at liberty to share your own opinion for what you wish would happen in this moment?
I mean, not really. Look, I always joke, and I think I've joked with Lizzie, like my current job, like the more, I spend a lot of time with very strident people on either side, because peace building is not a liberal value, okay? Like it is a liberal value, but it's not liberalism, okay? It's not progressive. If all you're doing is speaking to other progressives, you haven't done anything, okay? Peace building should inherently make you uncomfortable. It should make you feel like, and humbling, that if you're wrong, what does that mean? And like all of the other things that should just make you panicked with doubt, but focused on what you're trying to achieve. And so it disables me from writing and doing other parts, but it puts me, I think, into an arena where I try and find and develop information and policies that give to other people. I'll just say, I think that my honest opinion isn't about what should or shouldn't happen. There's lots of ideas flying around, and I really can't talk about those, but I will say that it's really about trying to hold in your hands the collective humanity of what's happened. And if there's one phrase I come back to again and again, it is always that, yes, there is a tremendous asymmetry of power, but there is an absolute symmetry of fear and mistrust. And if we do not deal with that symmetry of fear and mistrust, however that's dealt with, it doesn't mean it just has to be people to people. It could be working on worldview analysis, that if people are motivated by religious law, be that Islamic or Jewish, or they're motivated by human rights, or they're motivated by pan-Islamism, whatever it is, trying to identify the elements that don't shatter their identities to get to a situation where we can deal with this fear and mistrust. And if we can't get there, we're not going to get anywhere. And that requires whether you're going for a one-state solution, a two-state solution, a confederacy. I don't care what the political outcome is. I do care, but I'm saying it doesn't matter what it is. The baseline underneath requires some of that. And I will say, going back to the hospitals and everything else, we've reached a point where there's no belief in what anyone says. And there's only a recognition of what is happening on the ground. And it's into that vacuum that all of the negative actors thrive. And so that's the complication, and that's the difficulty, and that's the hardness. And so I think that as much as difficulty as it is to try and hold that in our heart. And I will say, as Jews, it is not obvious, and it is not natural, and it is not automatic that you will have an influence on Israelis, okay? And if you do want to be able to use your privilege, it requires you understanding Israelis today. And that's very important, okay? And even if it's difficult, you have to. If you want to be able to use the privilege of being Jewish, if that's how people want to throw it on you, to be able to talk to your brothers and sisters who are there, you have to see them as brothers and sisters. And you can then use that however you want. But if you can't do that first part, there's no privilege to be used. And so for me, at least for me personally, it's never been about climbing in a hole with someone. It's about working out, if I'm outside of a hole, how can I actually help them out? And that's more difficult in some ways because it requires peace building rather than just solidarity.
All right, thank you so much, Joel, again.